Of the speakers here today, I think I'm the only one who was recently, within the past year, here for another conference on civic development and civic education. So when I came back, I sort of swaggered in as the old timer, and I already knew what a beautiful, lovely campus and what terrific people. So I'm really delighted to be back. I'm going to talk this afternoon about a couple of different things that came out of the Stanford Center on Adolescence, which is where I'm based in the School of Education at Stanford. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is a study of what we call civic purpose, and that's a study of civic and political participation in high school seniors, and it was drawn from California high schools with high percentages of immigrant and minority students from 3 different regions in California. So I'll come back to that. But that's the first topic that I'm going to address. And then secondly, I want to say a little bit about a consensus report that came out of the Center on Adolescence around a group of, a small group of experts in the field of civic education and civic engagement in young people, and they were chosen for the diversity of their own political positions and so on. And copies of that report are on the table over there, and I have a few more back at the hotel in case other people, those run out. So I'll come back to that, and I just want to give you a couple highlights from that when we get to that point. So the civic purpose study surveyed students at 2 time points, and started out with almost 1,600 students in these seniors in high school in 3 different regions of California. And subset of 50 of them took part in qualitative interviews, in-depth interviews with us. And then we followed both of them up. This was the beginning of their senior year in high school. We followed them up in the end of their first year post-high school. Intentionally, the sample was highly diverse, and 46% of the time 1 sample was pretty much the same time 2, was Latino, 29% Asian, 6% African American, 8% white, non-Hispanic, and then the rest were mixed or other, and it was about half girls and half boys. The survey included a 22-item measure of civic, volunteer, and political activity, which was adapted from the Youth Involvement Inventory by Mark Panzer and his colleagues. And we also included in it self-assessments of civic and political involvement, motivations for and barriers to civic involvement, measures of moral and civic identity, and various other scales in the survey. And this is all published in a series of articles on the study that are available on the Stanford Center on Adolescent website. So if you're interested in looking at the actual journal articles with the details, you can go to that website and they'll come up pretty quickly. So for that reason, I won't go into the details of the study here. One of the main goals of this project was to understand better what we call civic purpose, as well as other aspects of civic engagement in this kind of population. So I'll focus my remarks on the civic purpose part of that study, which was intended to give us a better understanding of those young people who are very committed to and quite involved with either political or non-political civic activities. We wanted to explore how these particularly committed young people think about their role in democratic society and how they develop, attach to, and act on democratic values. This work on civic purpose is reported in a paper that was published recently in the journal Human Development. The lead author is my colleague at the Center on Adolescence, Heather Malin, and that paper lays out the construct of civic purpose as we define it and reports on the study's findings. The paper describes the students who went beyond the kind of modest level of civic activity that was quite prevalent in this sample, as it is in most samples, to those who are highly involved and can be said to be really purposeful in the civic domain. These analyses are part of an ongoing series of studies at the center, and it's kind of a misnomer to call it the Center on Adolescence, because really we take a lifespan perspective on these issues. And so we're doing studies of purpose in a number of different domains, basically starting with the youngest we have going on right now is 8th graders, but it goes all the way up through people in their 60s and 70s, studies of purpose in different domains of life. Center on Adolescence Director Bill Damon, who, truth in advertising, I have to say, is my husband, and his now quite far-flung students and collaborators, developed this concept of purpose and defined it as a stable and generalized intention to accomplish something that is at once meaningful to the self and contributes to the world beyond the self. So it's a sustained commitment to something that entails goals that the individual is working toward, that the individual expects to remain committed to into the future, that is meaningful to the self, and that also in one way or another contributes to the world beyond the self. So that's what we mean by purpose. The area of civic purpose, obviously, is when this area of interest, commitment, and contribution has civic or political dimensions to it and centered there. I won't go into how we operationalize civic purpose in the survey, but it was basically composite indicators taken from a number of different scales in civic activity, the meaningfulness of future and ongoing civic goals to the individual, and what we call beyond the self motivation, motivation that goes beyond instrumental advantage for the self. So full-fledged purpose, civic purpose, requires the presence of all of these. The young people in our sample who met the criteria for civic purpose were engaged in many different areas of civic life. They were congressional interns, they were student representatives to civic commissions and committees in their communities or in the state. They were involved with immigration reform. They were, some of them were activist poets or performers in some other area of the arts. They were club leaders, they were party volunteers in mainstream politics. They were tutors, peer educators, and so on. They were very involved. A factor analysis of the 22-item civic activity scale revealed 3 major types of civic activity that form the focus of for these purposeful young people, and these probably won't surprise you if you're familiar with research in this area. They reflect what a lot of other people have found. And these were centered on fairly apolitical community service, traditional political activity, and what a lot of people have called expressive political or civic activity, which in our sample included quite a few that were expressive in the arts as well as on the internet and other means like Joe talked about this morning. Of course, the criteria for civic purpose are more demanding than those for civic participation as it's usually measured. So the share of our sample that shows full-fledged civic purpose was naturally a lot smaller than the share reporting some degree of civic participation, which was quite high. The majority of students had some degree of civic participation. Full-fledged civic purpose in contrast with several precursor forms that I can talk about if you're interested, but I don't want to take the time now, was present in 8.7% of the sample for community service focus, 6.3% for traditional political focus, and 4.7% for civic political expression. So actually the most common one was community service. As we predicted, high school students who were civically purposeful in this sense at time one were much more likely than their non-purposeful, though somewhat civically engaged peers, to still be highly engaged when reassessed at the end of their first year after high school. The engagement in the larger sample started out fairly high when they were in high school, but declined significantly between time one and time two. Comparisons of the civically purposeful youth with their non-purposeful peers led us to identify a number of themes that were especially characteristic of the purposeful young people. We fleshed these out. We saw these in both the survey data and the interview data, but we were able to use the interview data especially to flesh out in a more elaborated way the significance of these themes to the individual young people who talked about them. One thing that was distinctive in the purposeful group concerns the particular ways that their sense of identity motivated their civic action. We saw two different ways that civic identity was important for the purposeful young people. The idea that your identity as a civic person is part of the motivation for civic involvement. Civic action has been shown by a lot of people. I think what was coming out of this sample, which was a very particular kind of sample, of course, so I don't know how generalizable it is, but I thought it was thought-provoking. Anyway, it was a little different than just the idea that I see myself as a civically engaged person. The first, I'll hold that thought for a second. The first is what we call participant identity. Young people with civic purpose tended to be highly involved in various kinds of activities in their schools or in their communities, including both civic or political and also non-civic pursuits. Various kinds of clubs, the arts, sports, student government, and the whole gamut. And what I was going to say before is I think this kind of reminded me of what Joe Kahn was saying earlier about the students who on the internet seem to be interest-driven rather than, they were interested in a lot of things, engaging around those interests, whatever they might be, versus entirely social in their interactions, and how the ones that were more interest-driven are more likely to become civically or politically engaged, and that I think is consistent. So this idea that I want to be involved, I want to be part of it. Many who took part in the interviews said that getting very involved in school and community activities was important to their developing sense of self. The kind of person that they wanted to be. Maybe they felt they weren't yet, but they would like to be. Some talked about this direction as keeping them on track in the kinds of difficult settings and contexts and situations that many of them were living in. As one high school girl said, and I'll quote her, "My freshman year of high school, I wasn't doing well in classes. I was skipping school. I hung out with people who were not going places. The way I found to not go down this wrong path was to get involved. I started out with student council, and they made me feel like I belonged." And then she went on to many other things. I would say in some response to our very interesting noontime talk, we definitely saw kids who, at least in their self-report, were saying, I wasn't interested in anything. I wasn't heading anywhere good. And for one reason or another, I got involved. And once I started getting involved, I wanted to be more involved. And I found I had a lot of interests that I didn't know I had, or I didn't used to have. So I want to present a fairly hopeful picture. The second key way that we saw identity issues come up for our sample of purposeful young people was around social group identity and its role in motivating civic commitment. Especially in this kind of immigrant and heavily minority sample, this was often ethnic identity, but it could also be based in attachments to nationality, sexual orientation, some kind of geographic community, or a religious affiliation. In fact, there was one young person that we interviewed who was coming out of a particular identity group identity, but the identity group was Californian and American. So it wasn't necessarily, they're Latino or Guatemalan, or, it might have been. It wasn't in many cases, but not always. It was common for the purposeful young people to see civic action, as we've already talked about at this meeting, as a way to respond to, or at least give voice to these attachments. They were often motivated to do something about the difficult experiences that they saw their identity group facing. And if you want to talk about the people in these discussion groups who said, let me tell you about my experience, and you need to understand it from the point of view of somebody's been through that, that's what a lot of these kids were saying in the interviews. And so some, though not all of them, found ways to get involved in doing something about those things. But it's also important, you might think of ethnic identity, and it often was ethnic identity, but it's important to point out that ethnic identity doesn't always align well with civic involvement, especially for all immigrant and ethnic minority young people. In fact, some of the kids that we talked to said that they faced challenges to their civic engagement based on their ethnic group affiliation. Some of the girls in particular, those who came from Hmong backgrounds or certain Central American countries, said that they were under pressure from their parents and their families to step back from the civic engagement activities. These weren't always supported in their culture and in their community, particularly for girls. And so they felt like, in a way, they had to defy their family and their family's perception of appropriateness in order to be engaged. Motivation based on identity group was often important for the civically engaged students who were not fully purposeful as well. So in the larger sample, the most commonly cited motivator for civic activity was concern for issues that connect directly with their own and their families' experiences, such as immigration, which we've already talked about, school funding, which was a big issue in California right at that moment, community resources such as access to public libraries. There were a couple kids that were really worked up over that. Fairness in the criminal justice system, which we've already talked about at this meeting as well. And these kinds of reasons were endorsed by about a third of the young people who were somewhat civically engaged but not purposeful, as well as many of the purposeful kids. It seems that these direct connections that some low-income and minority or immigrant young people have with civic and political issues that might, for a middle-class, upper-middle-class audience, seem very abstract, they were much less abstract for these young people, and in a sense you could say they served as a kind of civic asset for them. And these experiences can lead students to become engaged if they see a way to connect with opportunities to work on those issues and feel that it's going to make some kind of difference. On the other hand, strong ethnic identity and awareness of issues like this that are important for one's group don't always lead to civic purpose, as I've said. And many of these young people who expressed interest in it and got a little bit involved in it did not become fully purposeful around it. So this is related to the second main factor that distinguished the purposeful from the somewhat engaged but not fully purposeful youth in our sample. And this second theme is one that I guess I haven't heard as much at this meeting so far. And that's that the purposeful young people in our sample were motivated by well-developed civic and moral values and beliefs. Particularly in the interviews, they reported strongly held ideals for and beliefs about society and citizens' responsibilities. And those convictions seem to play an important role in driving their commitment. Many of the purposeful young people had firsthand experience with the glaring discrepancies between the espoused values of our American democracy and their own actual lived reality. But their recognition of these gaps, for some reason, left their belief in the country's unrealized ideals intact, and that drove them to take action rather than to disengage and become cynical. And we've talked already about cynical young people, but not all young people are cynical, or at least if they're cynical in one sense, they're also hopeful and engaged in another. But as one young woman that we interviewed in the study said, "Injustices really make me angry. I feel like when you get angry about something, you're really called to do something about it. So I'm really proactive. If I see an injustice, I try to figure out a way that we can work together to try to change the situation." Among the civic beliefs that were important to the purposeful youth was a view that individuals in society are interdependent and that the well-being of any one person is affected by the well-being of the whole. They sounded like the Pope on his recent visit here, a lot of these kids. And we asked them in the interviews and in the survey as well, we had some items on it. Do you feel people are, in some sense, responsible for each other or to each other? And a lot of the kids absolutely didn't understand the question, and you couldn't get them to understand it without giving them our own view of the answer.